Welcome, dear friends and fellow literature enthusiasts. I am so grateful you've chosen to join me in this little corner of reflective conversation, where cinema meets the rhythms of storytelling and the deeper echoes of human experience. Before we step into today's exploration of Reacher 2022, I want to extend a heartfelt invitation. If you enjoy these kinds of thoughtful, layered discussions that treat film not just as entertainment, but as art, as text, as a cultural mirror, please do consider liking this video and subscribing. It's a small gesture, but it allows us to keep nurturing this community of curious minds who believe in the power of stories to sharpen our perception and, perhaps, soften our hearts. Now, a gentle disclaimer, almost a whisper before we begin. This is not a real movie review in the sense of consumer advice or a checklist of pros and cons. Instead, what follows is an intellectual, theoretical, and deeply personal analysis. It is meant for those of you who, like me, can't help but treat a film like a novel, as something to be read, annotated, pondered, argued with. My aim is not to tell you whether you should watch it, but to share what unfolds when we sit with the text and let it reveal its deeper contours. Think of this as a kind of conversation between film and literature, with me as your host, but you as my essential companion. When I think back to the first time I encountered this story on screen, I remember being immediately struck by its sense of weight. Not the physical weight of the protagonist, though that too is unmistakable, but the emotional density of the world it creates. There's a deliberate pacing, a quiet confidence in the way it allows silence to stretch between words. And it reminded me, oddly enough, of my first encounter with a crime novel as a teenager. How I would linger over the descriptions, how the stillness before the action could feel even more suspenseful than the violence itself. That memory came rushing back as I watched, and I realized how much of this viewing experience was less about spectacle and more about rhythm, about waiting, about trust in the patience of the audience. What fascinated me most was the world this narrative builds, not just geographically, with its small-town settings and its shadows tucked into ordinary streets, but philosophically. On the surface, it's a crime thriller. Beneath, it's an interrogation of order and chaos, justice and power, isolation and belonging. I found myself reflecting on the protagonist not as a hero in the conventional sense, but almost as a wandering figure from myth, a character who could step out of Homer or Conrad, someone whose sheer physicality is matched by an equally strong moral compass, though one that is rigid and unyielding. This quality resonated with me because, in many ways, it reminded me of people I've admired in my own life. Individuals who carry with them an integrity so sharp it can cut, sometimes even wounding those around them, but who never bend in the face of what they believe is right. Watching this figure stride across the screen, I couldn't help but think of those mentors, those distant relatives, those teachers who stood immovable in the storm. The narrative arc begins deceptively simply. A man arrives in a small town, an outsider with little explanation for who he is or why he's there. Immediately, the tension is set between him and the community. He is both threat and protector, stranger and savior. This duality, I think, is what makes the story so compelling. Literature is filled with outsiders who reveal the hidden truths of the societies they enter. Think of Kafka's Surveyor or Camus' Assault, figures who don't quite belong, and in their refusal to belong, they expose the hypocrisies of the structures around them. In this story, the outsider becomes both detective and avenger, peeling back layers of corruption that the town has quietly accepted as normal. The plot, of course, unravels into conspiracies, betrayals, and unexpected alliances. But what lingers in memory is not the specifics of who betrayed whom, but rather the way each revelation deepens our sense of the protagonist as a man utterly apart, someone who can fight for justice but never fully live within the community he defends. There's an irony there, a tragic note. He restores balance but cannot share in it. That paradox struck me with unusual force because it echoes something I've often felt in life. How those who step forward to defend or protect often find themselves standing apart, never quite integrated into the ordinary joys of those they help. One of the most riveting stretches of the narrative involves the gradual uncovering of a hidden network of crime, masked by the veneer of everyday life. What thrilled me here was not just the suspense, but the reminder of how literature often uses mystery and thriller structures as allegories for perception itself. Think of detective stories as metaphors for reading. We gather clues, interpret, misinterpret, draw connections, and only in hindsight do we see the full picture. In this sense, the film becomes a text about texts, invites us to question how we see, how we miss, how we're blinded by what we expect to find. Watching it unfold felt almost like reading a detective novel in real time, but with the added richness of gesture, silence, and the unspoken language of physical presence. And yes, there are major twists, moments when the rug is pulled from under us, when trust is broken, when violence erupts unexpectedly. I won't spoil the mechanics, because the surprise is part of the visceral experience. But what I will say is that each twist seemed less about shocking the audience and more about reminding us of the fragility of human connection. Characters who seemed trustworthy prove treacherous. Others who seemed peripheral suddenly become essential. It mirrors life, doesn't it? How often have we placed our trust in the wrong hands, or dismissed someone only to discover later their quiet importance? These turns of a narrative are not simply devices. They are, in my reading, reflections of the instability of human judgment. What elevates the whole experience for me, though, is the texture of its storytelling. The dialogue is sparse, almost minimalist, but that makes every word carry weight. The pauses, the silences, the long looks, all of it feels like a language in itself. It reminded me of Hemingway's iceberg theory, the idea that what is unsaid is more important than what is spoken. I found myself listening not just to what the characters said, but to what they chose not to say. And as someone who grew up in a family where silence was often as meaningful as speech, this resonated deeply. I remember dinners where the unspoken tension was louder than any argument, or moments of quiet solidarity that meant more than 100 reassurances. The film captured that dynamic in a way that felt hauntingly familiar. There's also the matter of justice, the beating heart of the story. The protagonist's relentless pursuit of truth and fairness raises uncomfortable questions. Justice in this narrative is not a gentle process. It is brutal, unforgiving, and absolute. It made me ask myself, is justice something we can truly embrace without compromise? Or does the pursuit of absolute fairness demand sacrifices, even collateral damage? I wrestled with this long after the credits rolled because I've seen in my own life how ideals can sometimes clash with compassion, how principle can sometimes wound more than it heals. And yet, there's something undeniably stirring in watching someone who refuses to bend, who insists on clarity in a world of shadows. Another aspect that struck me was the sheer physicality of the protagonist. His presence is overwhelming, almost mythic, and yet what kept me hooked was not his strength, but his restraint. Power, when untested, can be terrifying. But power held in reserve, power exercised with deliberation, that's a different kind of poetry. It reminded me of Greek heroes, whose might was inseparable from their flaws, whose very excess was both their gift and their downfall. Watching him, I thought about the human longing for protectors, for figures who can absorb violence on our behalf, even if they themselves remain untouched by the softness of belonging. I suppose, in the end, what makes this story so resonant for me is the way it combines the pleasures of genre with the depths of philosophy. It thrills, yes, but it also unsettles. It entertains, but it also teaches. I came away not just with adrenaline, but with questions about solitude, about the cost of integrity, about the uneasy dance between community and individuality. And isn't that, ultimately, what great literature does? It gives us a story that compels us, but underneath, it whispers questions that linger long after the last page, or in this case, the last frame. As I sit here, recounting my impressions, I feel as though I've invited you into my living room on a quiet evening, where we're all curled up with our cups of tea, letting the conversation wander from plot points to philosophy to personal memories. That's how I hope this space always feels. Less like a lecture, more like a shared reflection. Because the truth is, stories don't live in isolation. They live in us, shaped by our histories, our experiences, our beliefs. What I see in this film may not be what you see, and that's the beauty of it. Literature teaches us that the act of interpretation is deeply personal, and film, too, becomes a mirror, one that reflects differently for each viewer. So, as we bring this exploration to a close, I hope I've sparked not just your curiosity about the film itself, but about the ideas it raises, the tension between belonging and exile, the weight of justice, the fragility of trust, the unspoken languages of silence. If any of these themes have resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Let's continue this dialogue, not as critics or consumers, but as readers of the world, seekers of meaning, lovers of story. And once again, if you found value here, if you felt at home in this little pocket of conversation, please do like and subscribe. It means more than you might think. But most importantly, thank you for being here, for listening, for thinking alongside me. Until next time, keep watching, keep reading, and keep reflecting. The stories we share shape the lives we lead. When I think back to the beginning of this story, what strikes me most is not the noise, but the silence. There's a peculiar hush to the way everything starts, as if the world itself is holding its breath. We are not immediately flung into chaos, as many thrillers might prefer. Instead, we are asked to sit with the quiet arrival of a man who carries with him an air of mystery so palpable that even before we know his name, we understand his weight in the narrative. He steps off a bus, or rather, he seems to appear from nowhere, like a figure stepping out of a dream. This entrance feels almost mythological. An Odysseus come ashore, a stranger on whom the eyes of the community will soon fix. The town into which he arrives feels ordinary at first glance. It has the kind of streets you might find in countless places across the country. Small diners, weary shop fronts, people who know each other's names and gossip. But what I've learned, both in fiction and in life, is that ordinariness often hides the most extraordinary shadows. And here, too, beneath the familiarity, a storm is brewing. The man's arrival coincides with unease in the town. Whispers of violence, suspicions of corruption, a lingering sense that something is terribly wrong just out of sight. I couldn't help but recall the small town I grew up near, where everyone thought they knew everything about everyone else. But in reality, the unspoken rules, the buried scandals, were the very things that bound the community together. Watching this narrative unfold, I felt that same eeriness, the surface simplicity that conceals entire labyrinths beneath. No sooner has he set foot in town than suspicion falls upon him. There's something almost biblical about this. How quickly a stranger becomes a suspect. How swiftly fear attaches itself to what is unfamiliar. He is arrested, accused of murder, and we are drawn into the machinery of the town's justice system. What I found so compelling here was not just the plot point itself, but the allegory it represents. The danger of assumption, the human instinct to blame the outsider. As I watched this sequence, I thought about the countless novels where outsiders become mirrors for the community's flaws. Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter comes to mind, as does Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. The outsider, by virtue of being different, threatens the fragile balance of conformity. And here, our protagonist becomes that lightning rod. The interrogation scenes are among the first to reveal his true character. He is silent, unyielding, confident without arrogance. He doesn't plead or justify himself. He simply exists, like a mountain that refuses to move. There's a peculiar poetry in this stillness. In an age where characters often prove themselves through words, here is a figure who proves himself through silence. That, for me, was profoundly moving. It reminded me of my grandfather, a man who spoke rarely, but whose few words carried more weight than the endless chatter of others. Watching this character in those interrogation rooms, I felt the same awe I used to feel sitting at my grandfather's knee, an awareness that sometimes saying less is saying more. Gradually, the truth begins to unfold. This man is not guilty, but he is not harmless either. He is a drifter, a former military policeman, someone with a past that makes him both formidable and enigmatic. The police realize, reluctantly, that they have no case against him. But by now, the town is aware of him, and his presence has unsettled the fragile structures of control. He is released, but his involvement in the town's affairs has already begun. What fascinates me is how the narrative uses this early misunderstanding as a kind of foreshadowing. It tells us that this man will always exist at the threshold, never fully guilty, never entirely innocent, forever walking that line where justice and violence blur. Soon, the plot thickens with the introduction of other key figures. A detective, weary but determined, becomes an uneasy ally. A young woman, caught between fear and loyalty, steps into view. And in the background, the shadowy figures of corruption begin to emerge. It is here that the story transitions from being about one man to being about a system. The town itself is implicated in a web of deceit, and what began as a murder investigation begins to unravel into something much larger. For me, this is one of the great pleasures of narrative structure. The way a seemingly isolated event expands into a panorama of interconnected betrayals. It feels almost like the unfolding of a Russian novel, where every small detail ultimately connects to a vast moral tapestry. There is a particularly striking moment when the protagonist, having been released, decides to investigate the murder himself. This decision reveals something essential about him. He is not content to walk away, though he could. He is drawn to justice in the way some are drawn to faith or to love. It is not a choice, but a compulsion. I found this deeply resonant because I know what it feels like to be unable to turn away from what feels wrong, even when silence or retreat would be easier. There is a certain kind of person, rare but unforgettable, who cannot rest until the truth is unearthed. Watching him step into that role, I felt both admiration and a kind of sorrow because I knew the cost that kind of commitment often exacts. As the investigation unfolds, the town's layers are peeled back. Corruption seeps into places of power. Money flows in hidden channels. Allies reveal themselves as compromised. And through it all, the protagonist moves like a force of nature, methodical, relentless, and deeply human in his occasional flashes of vulnerability. I was particularly struck by the way the story balances his physical dominance with moments of quiet thoughtfulness. He is not merely a man of action. He is a man of calculation, of patience. Watching him piece together clues reminded me of long nights I spent as a student hunched over books, trying to assemble meaning from fragments of text. There's a similar rhythm, the thrill of discovery, the frustration of missteps, the slow dawning of clarity. One of the key turning points in this portion of the story is the discovery that the initial murder is not an isolated act, but part of a broader conspiracy. This revelation shifts the narrative from the personal to the systemic. It's no longer just about avenging one death. It's about exposing an entire network of corruption that has its claws deep in the town's institutions. I found myself thinking about the ways in which literature often uses murder as a symbolic act, not just the taking of a life, but the silencing of truth, the suppression of justice. Here, too, the murder is not random. It is a symptom of a larger rot. That insight made me pause, because it reflects a truth about society itself. Individual acts of violence often point to deeper, more insidious structures of power. Alongside the investigation, there are moments of unexpected connection. The protagonist, for all his solitude, begins to form tentative bonds with those who share his pursuit of justice. There is camaraderie in the face of danger, and though he resists intimacy, the cracks in his armor reveal glimpses of humanity. I was moved by these interactions because they reminded me of the paradox of solitude. Even the most independent souls sometimes long for connection, and sometimes, without realizing it, they find it in the unlikeliest of places. Watching him share small moments of trust with allies made me think of times in my own life when I, too, found companionship where I least expected it. The violence that punctuates these early chapters is sudden and brutal, but never gratuitous. It is violence as punctuation, not as narrative filler. Each act of aggression reveals something about the stakes, about the character of the protagonist, about the ruthlessness of the enemies he faces. I found myself reflecting on how literature often grapples with violence, as both a destructive and a revelatory force. In Dostoevsky, in Faulkner, in Morrison, violence is never just physical. It is metaphysical, symbolic, a tearing open of the human soul. Here, too, every fight, every confrontation seems to echo beyond itself, asking us to consider the cost of survival, the fragility of order. As the plot continues to unfold, the threads tighten. The conspiracy reveals its scale. Those who seemed untouchable are implicated. The protagonist moves deeper into danger, not out of recklessness, but out of inevitability. It is as if the narrative has locked him into a path from which there is no retreat. And this, I think, is one of the most profound truths of storytelling. Sometimes the hero does not choose the journey chooses the hero. Watching him walk this path, I felt the weight of inevitability pressing down, as though fate itself were guiding his steps. By the time this section of the story reaches its turning point, the sense of tension is almost unbearable. The town is no longer just a backdrop. It has become a character in its own right, treacherous, corrupt, complicit. The protagonist has uncovered enough to know the scale of the darkness he faces, but not yet enough to dismantle it. And so he stands, poised at the threshold of greater conflict, carrying with him not only his own strength, but the fragile hopes of those who believe, however tentatively, that justice might still prevail. And here I pause, not because the story itself pauses, it continues relentlessly, but because I want to linger in this moment of transition. There's a particular kind of beauty in the halfway point of a narrative, when the shape of the conflict is revealed, but the resolution is still distant. It is like standing on a mountain ridge, seeing the path that brought you here and the steeper climb that lies ahead. In this story, that ridge is marked by revelation, by danger, by the growing awareness that the struggle is larger and darker than anyone imagined. And as I reflect on it, I cannot help but think of my own life's ridges. The moments when I realized that what I thought was a simple challenge was only the beginning of something far more complex. This first stretch of the story lingers with me because it encapsulates so many of the themes that literature has always cherished. The outsider as truth-teller, the town as microcosm of corruption, the murder as metaphor for hidden rot, the reluctant hero compelled by an unyielding sense of justice. Watching it unfold was not just entertainment. It was like reading a great, sprawling novel that insists you confront not just what happens, but what it means. And though the narrative will carry us further, into even darker and more complex territory, this opening movement already feels complete in itself, a symphony of silence and violence, suspicion and revelation, solitude and fragile connection. What has always struck me about the moment when the story crosses its midpoint is how the world seems to shift beneath our feet. By now, the quiet has long since given way to tremors of violence and revelation, and what once seemed like a self-contained puzzle reveals itself to be only the surface of something far deeper. There is a particular tension in the air, as though the town itself has grown restless, aware that secrets cannot remain buried much longer. The protagonist, having peeled back the initial layers of deception, now finds himself staring into an abyss of conspiracy that extends far beyond what anyone could have guessed. For me, watching this part of the narrative unfold felt oddly like reading the final chapters of a novel late into the night, when fatigue sharpens one's senses rather than dulling them. Every revelation hits harder, every silence feels more loaded. It's that peculiar mixture of dread and exhilaration, the recognition that you are hurtling toward an ending, and that the ending will not allow you to emerge unchanged. One of the most powerful elements at this stage is the way the narrative raises the stakes. What began as the death of one man is now revealed to be part of a network of corruption that stretches across the town and beyond, a system of greed and power that thrives in secrecy. And the protagonist, having taken it upon himself to unravel this web, realizes that he has drawn the attention of enemies far more dangerous than he could have initially imagined. The shift is almost Shakespearean. The lone figure becomes pitted against a structure, a system, a kingdom of shadows. There is a crucial twist that deepens the emotional gravity of the story. The realization that the murdered man with whom this journey began was not just a random victim, but someone intimately connected to the protagonist's own past. This revelation lands with the force of tragedy, transforming the investigation from a matter of justice into a matter of personal reckoning. I remember pausing at this moment, letting the weight of it sink in. How often does literature remind us that what we pursue outwardly is also what we wrestle with inwardly? Oedipus searches for a killer only to find himself. Pip seeks fortune and discovers disillusionment. Here, too, the journey outward leads inexorably inward to wounds that cannot be ignored. The violence intensifies, both in frequency and in intensity. Enemies close in, traps are set, and the protagonist responds with a kind of brutal precision that is both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Yet what fascinated me was not the action itself, but the way it revealed character. Each confrontation seemed less about physical dominance and more about moral confrontation. To strike back against corruption requires not just strength, but certainty. And that certainty is tested again and again. I found myself thinking of moments in my own life when standing up for what I believed in cost me dearly. Times when the easier choice would have been silence, but silence would have been betrayal. The battles on screen reminded me that every act of defiance, whether small or large, is a fight against the inertia of compromise. As a conspiracy unravels further, unlikely alliances begin to form. The protagonist, though solitary by nature, finds himself bound to others who share his pursuit of truth, even if their motivations differ. A detective becomes not just a partner in investigation, but a companion in the struggle, someone who understands the stakes. A local ally, whose loyalties once seemed uncertain, proves essential. These connections are fragile, but vital. And I found them deeply moving because they echo one of the oldest truths in storytelling, that even the strongest figures cannot stand alone forever. Achilles had Patroclus, Don Quixote had Sancho, Holmes had Watson. Companionship is not just narrative texture, it is salvation. The town itself becomes increasingly hostile, its institutions revealed as complicit, its leaders exposed as puppets of larger forces. There's a haunting sequence in which what seems like a trusted figure is unmasked as part of the corruption. The betrayal stings, not only for the protagonist, but for us as viewers, because it plays on our own instinct to trust those who seem authoritative. It reminded me of moments in life when people I had admired revealed themselves to be less noble than I had imagined. That disappointment, the crumbling of an ideal, felt mirrored in this betrayal, and it deepened my understanding of the story's moral landscape. Corruption is not only external. It seeps into the very fabric of relationships, forcing us to confront the fragility of trust. The deeper the protagonist digs, the clearer it becomes that money is at the heart of the rot. Illegal operations hidden behind respectable facades, greed cloaked in civic language. The narrative makes us confront the way ordinary structures can mask extraordinary corruption. I found myself thinking of Balzac's famous line, "Behind every great fortune is a great crime." Watching the unraveling of the conspiracy, I thought of how often literature warns us that prosperity built on secrecy is rarely innocent. And perhaps that is why this story resonates so strongly. It insists that what we mistake for stability often rests on foundations of deceit. The climax builds gradually, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Every revelation, every betrayal, Every fight scene leads us inexorably toward the confrontation with those who orchestrated the crimes. By now, the protagonist is no longer merely an investigator. He has become an avenger, carrying not only his own weight, but the memory of the lives destroyed by the corruption. There's something mythic in this transformation. He becomes less a man than a figure of retribution, like Aeneas storming through Troy, or like a tragic hero who recognizes that his path is both chosen and fated. What makes the climax so powerful is not only the physical confrontation, but the moral one. The final revelation of the conspiracy's true architects is both shocking and, in a way, inevitable. Literature has taught me that the greatest twists are those that feel surprising in the moment, but, upon reflection, could never have been otherwise. That's how this moment felt. The architects of the corruption were hidden in plain sight, their respectability a mask for their crimes. And when the mask falls, the horror is not only in their actions, but in the realization that the town itself allowed it, even enabled it. The confrontation itself is brutal, unrelenting. The protagonist fights with a ferocity that feels almost otherworldly, yet what lingers is not the violence, but the justice it enacts. Watching him dismantle the machinery of corruption, I felt both exhilaration and sorrow. Exhilaration, because there is catharsis in seeing wrongs avenged. Sorrow, because justice here comes at such a cost. It leaves ruins where once there might have been healing. It reminded me of the old Greek idea that justice and tragedy are inseparable, that to set the world right often requires tearing it apart. And then comes the resolution, quieter but no less powerful. The conspiracy is exposed, the guilty are punished, the town breathes again. But for the protagonist, there is no celebration, no belonging. He does not stay to bask in gratitude or to enjoy the community he has saved. Instead, he prepares to leave, to move on once more into the shadows. This, perhaps, is the most poignant truth of the story. The hero who brings justice is not the hero who enjoys its fruits. He is destined to remain apart, a wanderer, a figure who restores balance but can never share in it. That ending touched me deeply because it spoke to the loneliness of integrity. I thought of those people I have known, teachers, activists, even friends, who gave themselves fully to a cause but never seemed to find peace in ordinary life. They carried a restlessness, a sense that their work was never finished. Watching the protagonist walk away, I saw that same restlessness. He is not broken, but neither is he whole. He is, in a sense, a permanent exile, forever moving, forever fighting, forever apart. As the credits rolled, I sat in silence for a long time. I thought about the cost of justice, the fragility of trust, the inevitability of betrayal, the necessity of companionship, and the loneliness of those who refuse to compromise. I thought about how stories like this are not simply entertainment, but meditations on the human condition. And I realized, once again, why I am drawn to narratives like this, because they remind me that the struggle for truth is both timeless and timely, both mythic and personal. What makes the story endure in my memory is not the twists or the violence, though those were crafted with skill. What endures is the emotional truth it reveals, that to fight for what is right often means standing apart, that to expose corruption often means confronting betrayal, and that to restore balance often means sacrificing belonging. It is a truth I have felt in my own life, and perhaps you have too. And that, I think, is why stories like this matter. Not because they distract us from reality, but because they illuminate it. And so, as I look back on the arc of this narrative, I feel gratitude. Gratitude not only for the craftsmanship of the story, but for the way it invited me to reflect on my own journey. In the end, that is what the best stories do. They hold up a mirror, and in the faces of fictional characters, we see glimpses of ourselves. What lingers most, long after the dust of the plot has settled and the last echoes of violence have quieted, are not the mechanics of the story, but the people who inhabit it. For me, the measure of a narrative's depth lies not only in what happens, but in who it happens to, and how those individuals carry the weight of their choices. In this case, The characters feel less like constructs of a script and more like figures pulled from the pages of myth and literature, etched with contradictions, shaped by their silences as much as by their actions. At the center stands the drifter, the wandering figure who refuses permanence, who carries himself like a man both liberated and burdened by his own freedom. He is massive, physically overwhelming, a presence that fills every frame he inhabits. And yet, what fascinates me is not his size, but his restraint. He has the strength to break almost anyone in his path, but the discipline to hold back until absolutely necessary. It's a paradox I've always admired in both real people and literary figures. True power is not the ability to unleash violence, but the ability to choose when not to. Watching him, I thought of Odysseus, whose cunning was always more dangerous than his sword, or of Hemingway's Old Fisherman, whose quiet resilience mattered more than the fish he fought. This protagonist carries his solitude like a second skin. He speaks little, reveals even less, and resists intimacy with an almost stubborn consistency. And yet, there are cracks, moments when compassion seeps through, when his actions betray a deeper sense of care than his words ever could. I found these glimpses profoundly moving, because they reminded me of people I have known who were uncomfortable with vulnerability, yet whose kindness revealed itself in action rather than speech. The uncle who could never say, "I love you," but would show up at dawn to fix your broken car. The friend who teased relentlessly but defended you fiercely in your absence. There is a purity in such indirect love, and I recognized it in the way this character protects without demanding recognition. His moral compass, though rigid, is not naive. He knows the world is corrupt. He expects betrayal. He anticipates violence. And yet, he holds to a personal code as if it were the only thing tethering him to humanity. This code is uncompromising. The guilty must be confronted, the innocent defended, the truth pursued no matter the cost. Some might call this simplistic, even dangerous, and there were moments when I, too, questioned the harshness of his choices. But there is something undeniably compelling about a man who refuses to bend in a world that thrives on compromise. It reminded me of Camus' idea of the absurd hero, the figure who persists in defiance even when meaning is fragile, even when the world offers no guarantees. Surrounding this central figure are others who, in their own ways, reflect facets of his character. The detective, weary but determined, serves almost as a foil. Where the protagonist is solitary, the detective is embedded in the community. Where the protagonist speaks little, the detective probes with questions. And yet, beneath their differences, both share a commitment to justice, even if they arrive at it through different paths. I saw in their dynamic a kind of literary duality, like Watson and Holmes or Sancho and Quixote, the pairing of pragmatism and idealism, of social tether and solitary vision. What I found most moving was not their differences, but their gradual recognition of kinship, that wordless understanding that though they walk different roads, they are, in essence, fighting the same fight. Then there is the woman who becomes an unexpected ally, a figure who navigates her own vulnerabilities while refusing to be passive. Her presence complicates the story in necessary ways. She reveals the cost of courage for those without the protagonist's physical power, the way ordinary people must risk far more to confront corruption. I found myself drawn to her resilience, because it reminded me that heroism is not measured only in strength, but in endurance, in the willingness to act even when the odds are overwhelming. She humanizes the narrative, grounding it in emotional reality. Where the protagonist's stoicism sometimes feels mythic, her determination feels familiar, relatable, even tender. The antagonists, too, deserve attention, for they are not merely villains but embodiments of something larger. They represent greed, corruption, the seduction of power. What unsettled me most about them was their ordinariness. They are not grotesque monsters, but polished figures, respectable on the surface, smiling in public. This ordinariness is more chilling than overt malevolence, because it reflects the truth that corruption often hides in plain sight. I thought of Iago in Shakespeare. Charming, plausible, devastating. Or the bureaucrats in Kafka. Faceless yet oppressive. Watching these characters, I realized again how evil often thrives not through chaos but through structure, not through spectacle but through quiet complicity. And yet, it is not only the central figures who matter. Even the minor characters carry symbolic weight. The townspeople who look the other way remind us of how communities sustain corruption by choosing silence. The frightened witnesses who hesitate to speak echo the precarious balance between survival and truth. Each figure, however small, contributes to the moral tapestry of the story. And I found myself reflecting on how often, in real life, history is shaped not only by the great figures, but by the countless ordinary ones who choose either courage or cowardice in small, unseen moments. Returning to the protagonist, what fascinates me most is the paradox of his existence. He is both deeply human and strangely mythic. He feels pain, loss, and even hints of longing. And yet, he seems destined never to belong. He saves communities, but does not join them. He exposes corruption, but does not live in the light of the justice he restores. He walks away always. This pattern struck me as profoundly tragic because it mirrors the archetype of the eternal wanderer, the figure who restores balance but can never taste peace. Like Cain marked to wander, like the gunslingers of old westerns, he is a man whose home is the road, whose solace is solitude. Why does this resonate so deeply with me? Perhaps because I have known moments of being both inside and outside, a belonging yet never fully belonging. Times when I helped others, but could not share in their joy. Times when I stood apart not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. Watching him leave at the end, I felt the ache of recognition. The cost of integrity is often exile. The supporting figures in their own ways highlight this exile. The detective, who returns to his role in the community, reminds us of what the protagonist cannot have. The woman, who finds courage and growth, represents the possibility of healing that he himself cannot pursue. Even the defeated antagonists, stripped of their power, linger as ghosts of what he cannot destroy entirely. The persistence of corruption, the inevitability of new battles to come. What I find remarkable about the character construction is how each person in the story reflects a facet of the central theme. The protagonist embodies justice and exile. The detective represents community and compromise. The woman embodies courage and vulnerability. The villains represent greed, disguised as respectability. Even the silent townspeople represent complicity and fear. Together, they form a mosaic, a chorus of voices that echo the same truth. That justice is never simple, never clean, never without cost. The protagonist's silences, more than anything, haunt me. He rarely explains himself, rarely offers insight into his inner world. And yet, those silences are eloquent. They remind me of Hemingway's idea that the unsaid is often more powerful than the said. They force us as viewers to lean in, to interpret, to imagine. And in that act of interpretation, we become participants in the story, filling in the gaps with our own fears, our own memories, our own longings. I think often about the loneliness that radiates from him, and I wonder whether it is chosen or imposed. Does he prefer solitude, or has solitude been forced upon him by the rigidity of his code? It is a question literature has long wrestled with. Is the exile of the hero voluntary or inevitable? Is Achilles lonely because of who he is, or because no one else can match him? Is Kafka's protagonist alienated by choice or by circumstance? These questions, unanswered, give the character his depth. They make him not just a figure of action, but a figure of contemplation. What moves me most about the character analysis is not that he is perfect or flawless. On the contrary, his flaws, his stubbornness, his lack of empathy at times, his inability to stay, are what make him human. It is tempting to idolize him as a figure of pure strength, but that would flatten his complexity. He is admirable precisely because he is torn, because he carries wounds he does not speak of, because his very virtues isolate him. This contradiction is what elevates him from archetype to character, from symbol to person. And so, when I think of this story, I think less of the battles won or lost, and more of the faces, the gestures, the silences. The detective's weary resolve, the woman's quiet bravery, the villain's polished deceit, the townspeople's complicit silence, and above all, the protagonist's lonely walk into the distance, a silhouette of both strength and sorrow. Perhaps that is why this narrative stays with me, because it reminds me that characters, like people, are defined not by single traits, but by contradictions. Strength and restraint, justice and exile, courage and fear, greed and respectability, vulnerability and resilience. Together, they create not a simple story, but a human one, layered and imperfect, demanding reflection rather than easy answers. And as I sit with these characters in memory, I realize that what I love most about them is that they refuse to leave me alone. They linger, not as cardboard figures of genre fiction, but as companions in thought, whispering questions, stirring emotions, inviting me to see myself in them, to recognize in their struggles echoes of my own. There is something almost intoxicating about peeling back the surface of a film we've all watched and finding, tucked behind the curtain, little secrets, strange facts, hidden anecdotes, and quiet oddities that make the story of its making as rich as the story told on screen. I've always felt that learning about these details is like sitting with an old friend who whispers conspiratorial truths in your ear, things you weren't supposed to know, but once you do, you can never forget. And with this particular production, there is no shortage of such whispers. The strangeness isn't loud or sensational, but woven delicately into the process. Choices, accidents, coincidences, and quirks that, when strung together, create a tale almost as captivating as the finished film itself. One of the most curious aspects lies in the casting of the lead role. The decision to choose an actor who towered physically over most of the cast was not simply a matter of appearance. In production conversations, it was said that the sheer bulk of the lead was meant to act like an invisible costume. He didn't need armor, weapons, or exaggerated gestures to convince us of his dominance. His very silhouette did that work for him. I found this fascinating because it flips the idea of acting on its head. What we often think of as performance was here achieved by restraint, by the stillness of a body that already carried myth in its frame. It reminded me of how, in literature, characters like Melville's Ahab or Conrad's Kurt's command presence not through constant action, but through an aura of inevitability. Behind the scenes, though, this physicality created unexpected complications. There were stories from the set of chairs snapping under his weight, of door frames suddenly seeming too small, of camera angles constantly being adjusted because he would dwarf every other actor in the frame. A cinematographer joked that shooting him was like trying to frame a mountain. You could never quite capture the whole, so you learn to suggest its enormity instead. I love this image because it reveals how even technical choices in filmmaking become little metaphors. A mountain cannot be contained, only hinted at, and perhaps it is why the protagonist feels larger than the screen itself. Another strange fact, the silence. Not the silence of the finished product, though that too is notable, but the silence on set. The lead actor had a habit of staying in character between takes, not in the dramatic, performative sense of method acting, but through stillness. Crew members said he would often sit for long stretches without speaking, reading quietly, or simply waiting. Some found it intimidating, others found it oddly calming. One makeup artist described it as like working next to a statue that might suddenly come to life. What fascinates me here is how this quiet energy bled into the final work. Silence became contagious, shaping the rhythm not only of the scenes, but of the entire atmosphere. Costume design, too, holds its peculiarities. The wardrobe team decided early on that the protagonist would wear clothing that was intentionally unremarkable. Basic shirts, plain jeans, no flourishes. But achieving this plainness turned out to be anything but simple. They tested dozens of fabrics, rejecting many because they either looked too polished on camera or wrinkled too quickly. The paradox was that to look ordinary required extraordinary effort. I found myself smiling at this detail because it reminded me of writing itself. How often the most effortless sentence is the one that took the longest to craft. Simplicity, whether on the page or the screen, is rarely simple. There were also accidents that became deliberate choices. In one scene, for example, a fight sequence was choreographed down to the smallest detail, but a prop malfunction caused an unexpected break in the rhythm. Instead of cutting, the director kept rolling, and the improvisation that followed was so raw and convincing that it ended up in the final cut. Watching that moment now, one might assume it was scripted, but knowing it wasn't adds a new layer of appreciation. It makes me think of how often in literature the most memorable passages feel like accidents, bursts of unplanned brilliance that emerge in the cracks of structure. Then there's the matter of location. The town we see on screen is not, of course, the real place from the source material. Instead, it was stitched together from different filming sites, with storefronts repainted and streets rearranged. But here's the oddity. Locals who lived near the filming areas reported that even when the crew wasn't shooting, strangers would drive in, assuming the town was real. Some visitors even asked about crimes and scandals, as if the fiction had somehow become fact. This blurring of the line between reality and narrative fascinated me. It reminded me of how readers of Dickens once wrote to him asking for updates on fictional characters, unable to separate the world of the novel from their own. Animals, too, played their part in the production's strangeness. A stray dog reportedly wandered onto the set one evening, refusing to leave. Instead of forcing it out, the crew adopted the animal temporarily, feeding it and allowing it to roam freely. Some even swore that its quiet presence softened the atmosphere, that the dog became a kind of mascot for the production. Though it never appears on screen, knowing it was there feels significant, almost like a ghost woven into the fabric of the story. I often think of such details as reminders that narratives are not just made by scripts and cameras, but by the lives that brush up against them, even by accident. One of the quirkiest pieces of trivia is that the fight sequences were rehearsed without sound. Rather than relying on choreographers shouting instructions or stunt doubles calling cues, the cast practiced in silence, moving through the motions like a kind of violent dance. They believed that if the rhythm could carry itself silently, it would feel more natural when sound was added later. The result is that those scenes have a strange musicality to them, a choreography that feels almost balletic despite the brutality. Watching them with this knowledge changes the way I perceive them, not as chaos, but as a kind of physical poetry. Perhaps the strangest occurrence of all was the weather. Several key scenes were scheduled for clear, sunny days, but sudden storms repeatedly disrupted filming. At first, the crew cursed the inconvenience. Yet when they reviewed the footage shot under gray skies, they realized the storms lent a moodiness the story needed. Instead of fighting the weather, they embraced it, rewriting the shooting schedule to let the unpredictability of the natural world seep into the narrative. It strikes me as poetic that a story so concerned with chaos and control should itself be shaped by the uncontrollable hand of the elements. Another little-known detail is that the lead actor insisted on doing almost all of his own stunts. This is not unusual in itself, but what fascinated me was his reasoning. He explained in interviews that the character's physicality was so essential that handing it over to a stunt double would feel dishonest. He wasn't chasing thrills or ego. He was chasing authenticity. That, to me, feels almost literary in spirit, as though he were a writer refusing to let anyone else touch a single sentence of his draft. Watching him in those scenes, I feel the weight of that commitment. The bruises were real, the strain was real, and because of that, the character feels real. Music, too, hides strange stories. The score, sparse and subtle, was reportedly composed with unusual instruments. Household objects struck or plucked, then layered into the soundtrack. A coffee mug becomes a drum. A piece of scrap metal becomes a resonant chord. Listening with this in mind, I began to hear the music differently. Less polished, more lived in, like the sounds of an ordinary world bent into something eerie. It reminded me of how some poets use the most mundane words to achieve the most profound effects, proving that the extraordinary often hides in the ordinary. There were also moments of tension on set that later became anecdotes of fondness. One actor confessed that he had been genuinely terrified during a confrontation scene, not because of the choreography, but because of the sheer intensity of his co-star's gaze. He admitted that no amount of rehearsal prepared him for the visceral force of that moment. And yet, the fear translated perfectly on screen. Knowing this, I watched the scene differently, not as performance, but as a raw human reaction, captured forever in film. Another detail that charmed me was the use of props. The protagonist's belongings are minimal, almost nothing, but each item was chosen with obsessive care. The book he carries, for instance, was not randomly selected. The production team debated which title best reflected his stoicism and worldview, eventually settling on one that resonates thematically with solitude and justice. Viewers might never notice it consciously, but the choice hums quietly beneath the surface, a literary echo hidden in plain sight. I find such decisions enchanting because they reveal the devotion to storytelling not only in broad strokes, but in the smallest brush marks. Finally, there's the odd fact of reception. When the show was released, fans of the original books dissected the casting and the choices with almost forensic obsession. Some praised the fidelity to the source material, others critiqued departures. But what amused me most was the discovery that even disagreements among fans became part of the show's mythology. Arguments spilled across forums, letters, and essays until the discourse itself felt like a parallel narrative, another layer of story unfolding in real time. It reminded me of how literary works often generate not just interpretations, but whole communities of debate, where the act of discussing the text becomes as important as the text itself. When I gather all these strange facts together, the towering presence of the lead, the silence on set, the accidental dog, the storms, the musical coffee mug, the meticulous choice of a book, I realize that they form a hidden narrative beneath the visible one. The story we watch is shaped by these quirks, even if we never know them. And that, to me, is what makes cinema magical. It is not just the script or the acting, but the accidents, the improvisations, the strange echoes of real life that find their way into the frame. And so, when I return to this film now, I no longer see it as just a piece of storytelling. I see it as a palimpsest, layered with unseen histories, ghostly presences, and accidental poetry. These behind-the-scenes strangenesses remind me that every story we consume has its own secret story, the story of its making, which lingers invisibly, shaping the way we experience it without us even knowing. And perhaps that is the strangest fact of all, that the invisible is always present, and that the making of a story is itself a story worth telling. There are moments when you settle into a film, letting its story wash over you, and then something happens, an event, a gesture, a sudden shift in tone, that reaches beyond entertainment and presses itself against your mind. These aren't just plot points. They're crossroads where character, theme, and emotion collide, forming something that lingers long after the credits roll. As I look back on this film, I find myself drawn to these significant events, not as a series of happenings, but as turning points where narrative deepens into meaning. They feel like the punctuation marks of a novel, where the rhythm is broken to demand reflection. I still remember the first event that pulled me firmly into its world, the protagonist's arrival in town. On the surface, it's nothing remarkable. A man steps off a bus and walks with calm assurance through an unfamiliar landscape. But there's a stillness here that is deliberate, a sense of someone carrying his entire history without needing to announce it. From a critical perspective, this arrival functions almost as a thesis statement. It tells us who this person is through absence rather than declaration. No luggage, no grand speech, no desperate reaching toward the future. Instead, there is simplicity, even emptiness, and yet an aura of power. It reminds me of how in literature, certain characters appear like archetypes rather than individuals. They seem to embody an idea first, and only later do we peel back the layers to discover the fragile humanity inside. This moment sets the tone. We know we're not watching just a story about crime and justice. We're watching an exploration of how myth and reality intersect. Not long after comes the first true act of violence. It is sudden, brutal, and almost uncomfortable to watch. And that is exactly its point. Too often, films glamorize violence, dressing it in choreography and polish. But here, the brutality is raw, stripped of any flourish. Critically, this establishes a moral framework. Violence is not spectacle, but consequence. It positions us not to cheer, but to witness. This choice has a ripple effect, shaping the audience's relationship with the protagonist. He is not a superhero, not a flawless savior. He is someone who lives in a world where force is sometimes necessary, but never clean. I couldn't help but think of Hemingway's idea of the iceberg theory, where the weight of a moment lies beneath the surface. The punches we see are only a fraction of the violence we feel. The rest is the moral heaviness implied beneath. There's also a quieter event early on, the first genuine conversation between the protagonist and the local detective. This moment fascinates me because on the surface it feels procedural, an exchange of information. But there's something deeper happening. Both characters are measuring one another, testing trust, feeling out the boundaries of power and intellect. For me, it mirrors the experience of reading a dialogue-heavy passage in Dostoevsky, where beneath the casual talk lies a struggle for dominance, respect, and understanding. What makes it significant is how it redefines the narrative stakes. The story is not just about external conflict, but about whether two worldviews can align long enough to uncover truth. This kind of tension is subtler than a fight scene, but no less dramatic, and it resonates deeply with audiences who appreciate psychological nuance. One event I found especially compelling is the discovery of corruption within the town. On one level, it's a classic narrative trope, the rotten underbelly of a seemingly ordinary place. But what struck me was the way it was revealed not as a grand conspiracy suddenly exposed, but as a series of small, almost mundane realizations. A missing file here, a shady glance there, a conversation cut too quickly. It's in these details that the film shows its literary soul. Corruption isn't a single villain pulling strings. It's a culture of silence, complicity, and fear that feels truthful in a way that resonates beyond fiction. It made me think about how often systemic problems in our world reveal themselves not through one dramatic revelation, but through the slow accumulation of little cracks in the facade. This narrative choice ensures the audience doesn't just consume the story, but reflects on it, perhaps even uncomfortably so. Of course, no critical exploration would be complete without examining the personal flashbacks. Sparse, fleeting, almost fragmented, they appear like shards of memory rather than full recollections. Their significance lies not in the information they give us, but in the way they destabilize the characters present. Trauma, loss, and isolation are not presented as melodramatic revelations, but as undercurrents, always threatening to pull the character under. What struck me most is how these glimpses refuse to explain everything. They resist closure, leaving space for the audience to imagine the full weight of his past. From a critical perspective, this is powerful. It aligns us with the reality of memory itself. Disjointed, incomplete, haunting. In literature, this technique often creates an unreliable narrator. Here, it creates an unreliable self, one who is not fully reconciled with his own history. One of the most riveting events, in my mind, is the protagonist's decision to intervene on behalf of someone who is powerless. The moment arrives almost quietly, without fanfare. He steps in, not because of duty or reward, but because his moral compass demands it. This choice elevates him beyond mere avenger or investigator. It positions him as a kind of wandering knight-errant, closer to Cervantes' Don Quixote than a modern action hero, though stripped of absurdity and infused with stoic realism. It is in these moments, rather than the explosions or confrontations, that the film reaches its deepest resonance. It asks, what do we owe to others, even when we owe nothing at all? That question lingers with me, as it likely lingers with many who watched. Then comes the midpoint revelation, which shifts everything. What we thought was a straightforward investigation fractures into something larger and more dangerous. From a narrative standpoint, this event is essential. It expands the scope of the story, transforming it from a local mystery into a confrontation with forces that reach far beyond the town. But its true power lies in how it redefines the character's place in the world. He is no longer just a man passing through. He is implicated, drawn in, forced to confront not just corruption, but the weight of his own choices. Critically, this is where the film insists that personal freedom is an illusion. We may think we drift untethered, but the world has a way of pulling us into its webs. For me, this echoes themes in Camus' work. The absurdity of believing in pure independence when the reality of existence is always entanglement. The climactic confrontations toward the end of the film deserve careful attention as well. What makes them remarkable is not only the intensity of the action, but the emotional layering beneath. Each fight, each face-off, carries the weight of accumulated grievances, betrayals, and moral reckonings. These aren't battles fought merely with fists or guns. They are battles fought with memory, with loyalty, with questions of justice. The critical impact here lies in the way the physical violence mirrors the inner violence of unresolved histories. When blows land, they carry not just physical force, but the symbolic force of everything that came before. This is why the final sequences resonate so deeply. They are less about who wins or loses and more about what the struggle signifies. What I found most moving, though, is the resolution, not in the sense of victory, but in the quiet aftermath. The protagonist departs much as he arrived, with minimal words, carrying no baggage, leaving behind both destruction and restoration. Critically, this cyclical structure is profound. It suggests that his journey is not about arrival or destination, but about perpetual wandering, perpetual reckoning. He is a figure who can never fully belong, because belonging would compromise the purity of his moral detachment. From a literary perspective, this is almost tragic. It recalls the archetype of the eternal outsider, the stranger who passes through, leaves an imprint, and vanishes. And yet, there's a strange beauty in it too. For the audience, this cyclical pattern ensures that the resonance lingers. The story does not close like a locked box, but remains open, humming with unfinished questions. From a broader critical perspective, these events collectively shape the film's reception and impact. They create a story that is not just consumed, but lived with, thought about, debated. Viewers respond not only to the surface thrills, but to the deeper implications. The cost of violence, the complexity of justice, the impossibility of pure freedom, the loneliness of moral integrity. It's this layering that explains why the film resonates so strongly with literature enthusiasts. It is not afraid of silence, ambiguity, or discomfort. It trusts the audience to read between the lines, to sense the iceberg beneath the surface. For me, the thematic and emotional resonance lies most strongly in the interplay between isolation and connection. The protagonist is, at his core, a solitary figure. And yet, event by event, we see him pulled into relationships, alliances, and moral responsibilities. Every act of violence, every moment of trust, every revelation of corruption presses him closer to others, even as he resists it. That tension between wanting to remain free and being inevitably tied to the world is what gives the story its haunting power. It mirrors something I feel deeply in life itself. The desire to remain untouched, to drift, to guard one's autonomy, and yet the inevitability of being bound by the needs and pains of others. And so, when the credits roll, the film doesn't leave us with answers, but with resonance. It leaves us with the weight of its events, significant not for their spectacle, but for their meaning. It asks us to consider justice not as a clean ideal, but as a messy, violent, deeply human pursuit. It asks us to reflect on freedom not as detachment, but as a fragile illusion. It asks us to think about loneliness, not as peace, but as exile. These are the questions that matter, the questions that keep the story alive long after the screen goes dark. In the end, I believe that is why this film remains impactful. Not because of its twists or its action, though those are executed with skill, but because of how its significant events weave into a tapestry of critical, thematic, and emotional depth. It is a film that rewards attention, patience, and thoughtfulness. It is, at its core, a story not just to be watched, but to be read like a text, like a novel, like a meditation on the strange, violent, beautiful complexities of being human. There's something oddly intimate about peeling back the layers of a film, isn't there? We watch the finished work, polished and seamless, as though it simply appeared fully formed out of some creative ether. But the truth is, behind every frame lies 100 choices, accidents, improvisations, and the fingerprints of countless people whose names most of us will never know. For me, one of the greatest pleasures of looking at a story critically is not only diving into its narrative and themes, but also tracing the echoes of its creation, those little behind-the-scenes currents that shape the river we see flowing on screen. The production itself becomes another story, parallel to the one we watch, with its own dramas, its own surprises, its own quiet poetry. When I first learned about how this particular project came to life, I was struck by how much it was treated like a rebirth rather than a simple adaptation. The creative team wanted authenticity above all. That word, authenticity, floated like a compass point over every conversation. They weren't interested in spectacle for its own sake. They wanted to create something that felt grounded, faithful, and raw. And that commitment began with casting. The search for the lead wasn't just about finding someone who looked the part, but someone who carried a certain physicality, a presence that could fill a room even in silence. Crew members have said that when the actor walked into his audition, the atmosphere shifted, not because he delivered a monologue of extraordinary nuance, but because his very stillness demanded attention. That, they realized, was the character. One of the most fascinating elements of production was the way the crew approached the world building of the small town at the story center. The set designers obsessed over tiny details, weathered signs, faded paint on buildings, the right mixture of grit and charm in a main street. They traveled to several real towns across the South, photographing, sketching, and sometimes even borrowing textures to recreate that sense of place. What I find beautiful about this is how much invisible labor goes into creating a setting we, as viewers, often take for granted. We notice the story. We rarely notice the cracked linoleum floor that someone hand-painted to look authentically worn. And yet those details matter. They give the subconscious a sense of reality, allowing the narrative to breathe. Behind the camera, there were countless little battles with weather and logistics. Filming in humid southern heat meant constant adjustments. Makeup that melted too quickly, costumes that grew damp with sweat, equipment fogging at the worst possible moments. There's a story I heard from one of the assistant directors about a day when the clouds refused to cooperate. They needed a scene bathed in golden sunlight, but the sky insisted on moody gray. Rather than wait endlessly, the cinematographer adjusted lenses, reflectors, and angles until the entire sequence appeared sunlit, without the sun ever shining. Watching it now, you'd never know that nature refused to comply. That's the quiet magic of film. It lies to us so beautifully we thank it for the deception. And then there were the fight scenes. Brutal, visceral, stripped of gloss. They weren't created by accident. The stunt coordinators worked meticulously to design sequences that felt heavy and real, each strike resonating with consequence. Unlike many productions where fights are choreographed like dance, here the team focused on exhaustion, on the ragged breaths between movements, on the awkward scrambles that real fights so often include. The lead actor insisted on doing as much of the physical work as possible, sometimes walking away with bruises that lasted weeks. There's a particular sequence set in a dim, claustrophobic space where every punch feels like it might shatter bone. Watching it, you feel the sweat and the dirt. What makes it extraordinary is that much of that sweat and dirt is real. They filmed take after take in sweltering heat until everyone was genuinely drained, then used that fatigue as fuel for authenticity. There are also those curious little accidents that end up defining a scene. One anecdote that always makes me smile involves a prop, a coffee cup left on a table. It wasn't meant to be there. Someone from the crew had set it down between takes, forgotten about it, and when the actors returned, it became part of the scene. The director noticed the way the actor absent-mindedly touched the cup while talking, and suddenly the moment felt alive, human, unscripted. That's the kind of serendipity you can't plan for, but it's precisely what makes film feel real. Later, when fans noticed the gesture, they praised its subtlety, never realizing it was born from an accident. Perhaps the most challenging part of the production was balancing tone. The director knew the story was heavy, filled with violence, corruption, and moral ambiguity. But he also knew that an unrelenting darkness can numb the audience. To counter this, the crew worked to weave in moments of levity and humanity, little interactions between characters, glances of humor, or pauses of warmth. Interestingly, many of these moments were improvised on set. The chemistry between the cast created space for spontaneous laughter, playful teasing, or quiet solidarity. The director encouraged it, telling them not to feel shackled to the script if truth wanted to leak out in a different way. Watching the finished product, you sense these beats of humanity grounding the story. They keep it from collapsing under its own weight. Something I found especially intriguing is how much the production leaned on literature to guide its tone. The writers and director kept a shelf of novels on set, dipping into passages during breaks. The crew has spoken about how these books served as spiritual companions, reminding them of the depth they wanted to capture. One day, after a particularly grueling shoot, the director read aloud a passage about isolation and justice to the cast and crew, using it as both inspiration and balm. To me, that's one of the most beautiful behind-the-scenes images. A group of tired filmmakers, sweaty and worn, sitting in silence as someone read from a book, anchoring their craft back to the roots of storytelling. There were also surprising bonds that formed off-camera. The lead actor, known for his quiet intensity, would often spend downtime teaching younger crew members small tricks of physical training. How to steady your breathing under strain, how to focus your body before exertion. He saw it not as showing off, but as sharing a discipline, a way of connecting. Meanwhile, the supporting cast often gathered for late-night dinners after long shoots, where conversations range from literature and philosophy to the absurdities of daily life. One actor has mentioned that these dinners felt as important to the production as the filming itself, because they built a trust that spilled over into the performances. Watching them on screen, you sense that trust. It's in the way their eyes meet, in the unspoken rhythms of dialogue. Sometimes, production creates unintentional folklore. One such story involves a location shoot at an abandoned warehouse. Crew members swore the place was haunted. Strange noises, flickering lights, an unshakable chill even in summer heat. Rational explanations were offered, of course, faulty wiring, echoes, drafts. But as the tale spread, the warehouse took on a life of its own. Some actors admitted they drew on that eerie energy during filming, using it to heighten tension. Whether or not the place was truly haunted hardly matters. What matters is how the myth bled into the work, giving the sequences filmed there an extra layer of unease. And then there's the curious world of props and wardrobe. The costume designer became obsessed with finding the perfect boots for the protagonist. Sturdy, unpretentious, worn enough to suggest history, but durable enough to endure months of shooting. After scouring countless stores, they stumbled upon a pair in a small-town shop, half forgotten in a dusty corner. Those boots became iconic, grounding the character with each step. Similarly, the weapons and tools used throughout the film were chosen with obsessive care, often modeled after real items to ensure weight and balance looked authentic on screen. One prop master joked that they spent more time researching knives and handcuffs than most people spend planning a wedding. Editing brought its own challenges and insights. The film's pacing is deliberate, unhurried, with moments of silence stretching longer than audiences are often accustomed to. Achieving that rhythm required courage from the editors, who resisted the urge to cut too quickly. They knew the power of lingering, of letting tension breathe. In fact, one of the most acclaimed scenes, a tense standoff where barely a word is spoken, was originally edited much shorter. But after reviewing it, the team realized that what made it powerful was precisely its length, the way the silence itself became a character. So they restored the pauses, trusting the audience's patience. That trust paid off. Of course, not everything went smoothly. There were days when tempers flared, when exhaustion made the smallest disagreements feel monumental. A camera malfunction delayed shooting for hours. A sudden storm destroyed part of the set. At one point, a car used in a chase scene broke down mid-shot, forcing the team to improvise with a different vehicle. These mishaps could have derailed the flow, but instead they became part of the production's rhythm. Filmmaking, after all, is about adaptation, about turning obstacles into opportunities. And sometimes, those forced changes lead to better outcomes than the original plan. What fascinates me most about these behind-the-scenes stories is how they reflect the same themes we see in the finished film. Resilience, improvisation, trust, and the weight of unseen forces. Just as the characters in the story navigate corruption and violence with determination, so too did the crew navigate weather, accidents, and exhaustion with creativity. The parallels are almost uncanny. Looking back, I realize that the production itself carries a kind of mythic resonance. It's not just about cameras and scripts. It's about people coming together to chase an idea, to breathe life into something imagined. It's about the small, strange facts that don't make headlines but linger in memory. The coffee cup that wasn't supposed to be there, the haunted warehouse, the boots found in a dusty shop, the sun that refused to shine but appeared anyway. These details might seem trivial, but they're what give the work its texture. And perhaps that's the truest insight of all. Films are built on details. Some are meticulously planned. Others are happy accidents. Some are born from sweat and struggle. Others from laughter and camaraderie. When woven together, they create something larger than any one person, something that feels inevitable when you watch it, but in reality was fragile at every step. To me, that's the wonder of it, knowing how easily it could have gone differently, and yet it didn't. It became exactly what it needed to be. So when I revisit this film now, I don't just see the story on screen. I see the invisible story behind it, the crew battling weather, the actors improvising warmth, the prop master obsessing over boots, the editor letting silence linger. I see the layers of labor, accident, and care that shaped what we all now take as inevitable. And I find that knowledge doesn't diminish the film's magic. It deepens it. Because to love a story is also to love the story of how it came to be. There are certain films where the story seems inseparable from the soil it grows out of, as though the landscape itself is a character with its own temperament, its own stubborn will. This one falls into that rare category. Every time I think back on it, I don't just recall faces and dialogue. I remember cracked sidewalks, the sticky sheen of summer air, the fluorescent hum of a diner that feels like it's been standing forever. The setting doesn't sit quietly in the background. It breathes, sweats, and intrudes. It carries scars, just like the people within it. Watching the film, you can't help but feel that the story could never unfold anywhere else. The geography shapes the psychology. The spaces shape the choices. The ground itself seems to rumble with history and menace. I remember the first wide shot that lingers on the small town where much of the story unravels. There's a deceptive ordinariness to it. Tidy storefronts, faded awnings, an old clock tower that suggests a slower, simpler rhythm of life. And yet, almost immediately, there's an undercurrent of unease. The sidewalks look just a little too empty. The windows of those shops reflect light, but not life. Even before the plot tightens its grip, the place whispers to you that something is wrong. That's the brilliance of the setting. It performs double duty. On the surface, it is perfectly mundane, but through the eye of the camera, it becomes a stage for paranoia, corruption, and violence. One of the most haunting spaces in the film is the local police station. It's not a sprawling complex, just a squat, nondescript building with walls painted in that institutional beige that seems designed to dull emotion. But the cinematography transforms it into a kind of moral crucible. The way the light falls, flat overhead fluorescence that drain color from skin, makes everyone look just a little more weary, a little more compromised. The camera often lingers on the peeling paint near door frames or the half-drunk cups of coffee sweating on desks. These details tell us more about the world than exposition ever could. It's a place where justice is supposed to live, but where rot is clearly set in. And every scene that unfolds there carries that tension, the sense that truth is being smothered under layers of bureaucracy and dust. Then there are the diners. Oh, the diners. They're more than just places to eat. They're sanctuaries, confessionals, battlefields in disguise. One in particular becomes a recurring backdrop for quiet confrontations and unexpected revelations. Its booths are lined with cracked red vinyl, its counters cluttered with ketchup bottles, its ceiling fans eternally whirring in lazy circles. The cinematography makes these spaces glow with a kind of melancholy intimacy. Warm, yellow-toned light spills across faces, softening even the hardest of characters, as though the diner is a place where everyone momentarily drops their armor. Yet, the clink of silverware or the creak of a door is enough to remind us that danger is never far away. It's a brilliant use of contrast, comfort set against dread. The outskirts of town play a different role altogether. Wide fields, abandoned warehouses, winding dirt roads. These are the settings that pulse with raw tension. The camera often frames these spaces in long, unbroken shots that emphasize isolation. You feel the distance, the silence, the vulnerability of being out in the open. When violence erupts in these locations, it feels even more brutal because of the stillness that precedes it. I remember one sequence where a confrontation takes place near a deserted industrial plant, its rusting metal skeleton looming in the background. The setting amplifies the scene's sense of decay and corruption. It's not just a fight between characters. It's a fight taking place in the shadow of a world that's already falling apart. The cinematography constantly shifts between intimacy and distance, drawing us closer when we need to feel the sweat on a character's brow, pulling back when we need to understand the geography of danger. There's a particular visual language at play here. Close-ups that capture flickers of doubt in a character's eyes, wide shots that dwarf them against oppressive landscapes, low angles that make violence feel unstoppable. The choices aren't flashy, they're purposeful. They make you feel, in your bones, the gravity of each moment. Lighting plays a profound role in shaping the mood. Daytime scenes are often drenched in harsh sunlight, every detail exposed, every flaw visible. There's nowhere to hide. It's a deliberate rejection of the noir tradition of shadows and alleys. Here, corruption thrives not in darkness, but in broad daylight, in spaces where everyone can see and yet no one intervenes. At night, however, the tone shifts. Neon signs buzz faintly, headlights cut through darkness like searchlights, and shadows stretch longer than they should. The duality between day and night mirrors the duality within the story itself, the surface of normalcy and the hidden depths of violence. One of the most memorable visual motifs is the use of glass and reflection. Windows, mirrors, even puddles become sites of distortion and revelation. Characters are often framed through glass, their images fragmented or blurred. It's as though the film constantly reminds us that perception is never whole, that truth is always fractured. In one tense scene, a confrontation plays out with the camera lingering not on the characters directly, but on their reflections in a diner window, distorted by streaks of rain. It's beautiful, unsettling, and thematically perfect. Sound, too, ties into the sense of place. The whir of cicadas in the heat, the distant bark of a dog, the metallic creak of a screen door. These are not background noises, but carefully chosen elements that root us in the environment. They make the world tactile. When silence arrives, it feels deafening, almost violent in itself. There's a moment where the soundtrack drops away entirely, leaving only the scrape of a chair against the floor, and that sound alone carries the weight of impending brutality. I can't talk about the setting without mentioning the way vehicles are treated. Cars aren't just transportation, they're moving stages. The cinematography inside vehicles often traps characters in tight frames, emphasizing tension. Rear-view mirrors reflect not only the road behind, but the paranoia of being followed. One chase sequence unfolds not with high-speed spectacle, but with deliberate, grinding inevitability. Dust rises from gravel roads. Engines roar like predators, and the landscape itself becomes part of the pursuit. It's a different kind of chase, one that feels heavier, more grounded, more suffocating. What fascinates me is how the setting interacts with the themes. This isn't just a story about violence and corruption. It's a story about what happens when decay hides beneath the surface of ordinary places. The town looks like anywhere, a place you might stop for gas or coffee without giving a second thought. But through the lens of the camera, that ordinariness becomes sinister. It forces us to confront the idea that darkness doesn't only dwell in distant cities or exotic locales. It can lurk in the familiar, in the unremarkable, in the places we trust. And yet, amid all this menace, there are moments of unexpected beauty.